Good afternoon to our viewers in Germany and good morning to our viewers in the United States. Hello, I'm Steve Sokol, the president of the American Council on Germany. I'm delighted to welcome you to today's conversation. Last month, Germany's government presented a new strategy for dealing with China. This came on the heels of the release of Germany's very first national security strategy in mid-June. The long-awaited China strategy, a draft of which was leaked in November, takes into account that the relationship between China and Germany, as well as the European Union as a whole, has changed. It also underscores that Berlin's economic and security policy vis-a-vis Beijing has to evolve accordingly. To discuss Berlin's new China strategy, I'm delighted to welcome Dr. Janka Oertel. She is the director of the Asia program and a senior policy fellow at the European Council on Foreign Relations. Janka, it is wonderful to see you again. Herzlich willkommen. Thank you for joining us.
Thank you, Stephen.
One of the things that is not listed in the bio that just appeared in the chat is that you have a new book coming out on China later this month. And so we wish you well with that publication. I know that the hard part of the work is behind you, having written the book, but I'm sure you're looking forward to promoting it and talking about the book. But today, we're together to talk about the 64-page China strategy, which really sort of shows that the government in Berlin believes that China is capable of negatively impacting Germany's economic and security interests. And it even calls Beijing a systemic rival. The strategy stresses the need for Europe's largest economy to reduce its economic dependence on its major trading partner, China. But I thought we could maybe start, Janka, by having you in broad brushstrokes give us the contours of this China strategy.
Yeah, so I think we will get back later to kind of, do you still tell the story of the glass half full or the glass half empty on the China strategy? Because I think you can sort of tell both stories if you want to. But what I would like to do, just kind of outlining a little bit for all of those who haven't read this fascinating document, which I understand if people did not have the time to look into it, is sort of the idea behind it. The idea was put into the coalition treaty that this government has given itself. It was something that the government had set itself to do, a task, a big task that it said it was going to achieve. And it was something that was, of course, being made a little more difficult by the Russian invasion of Ukraine. All the context, the world pretty much changed after the coalition treaty was signed. The world is a very different one from the one that the coalition treaty writers were thinking of at the time. And so it is not a real surprise that the China strategy took longer, which is one of the first questions that a lot of people ask and say, why did this take forever to write this thing? It's like, it's not that it has been so controversial within the government. It's just that the surroundings have changed so much and have sucked up a lot of energy that the question was, oh, really? So what we really need is a new China strategy now? Don't we have other problems to deal with? And actually, yes, this government had other problems to deal with. What this strategy is kind of the main task it had was, can this coalition government of three very different parties find sort of a collective description of reality? What kind of China are we actually seeing? What is the kind of China that we are describing here that Germany is interacting with? And what are we supposed to do about it? And on that front, I would say it gets like the full points. It finds a collective description of the kind of China that Germany is facing, one that is actually pretty close to the description that Ursula von der Leyen has given in her speech in March, one that is not full of illusions and full of unrealistic assessments, but that's pretty clear about the challenging new China that Germany is interacting with. And it gives a pretty good analysis of kind of what is the reality that Germany has to face up to. It then sort of goes into kind of the relationship with Europe and how it sets itself, how Germany sees itself in the Europe-China relationship. It goes into the bilateral relationship with China, and it goes then into the main focus of the strategy, that is the strengthening bit. The strategy is a lot more about us than it is about China. It's a lot more about what Europe and Germany need to do to deal with the world that they're facing, rather than an ambitious changing China strategy. That's not the idea of it. And the last bit, it focuses on sort of the international collaboration, cooperation dimension. So what can be done with the US? What can be done with the countries of the so-called global South? What can be done with other partners around the world in kind of creating an environment that is conducive to German and European interests at a time where the world is changing and where China is pushing in kind of changing the world in its interest and its own interest, and together with other partners such as Russia. And I think that's that's the framework within which all of this takes place. It spells out German values and interests quite clearly, the kind of world we would like to see. And that's the bit where it gets a bit more wobbly, because obviously all the things we would like to see, rule of law, human rights, reciprocity, like equal partnership in terms of our trading relationship, women's rights. Basically, you can go through that list. I think there's 12 points, and each and every one of them, you could probably make a good case for saying, well, the party doesn't see it that way in China. And that's where kind of our ambition runs into the reality that Germany is facing up to. And then maybe as I'm kind of closing up, and we can talk more about the details of it, I think by sort of reaffirming this holy trinity that the European Union has given itself, the partner, competitor, rival trinity, but then by re-emphasizing the rivalry bit and by being really clear about that element, this German strategy sort of puts a floor under where the European conversation on China can go and where it will go in the next few months. Because I think one of the things that is sometimes taken for granted is that the Ursula von der Leyen version of this is where the European Union is on China. But that's not true. The European Union is sort of all over the place when it comes to China, because China now matters. It's really important. It's hugely important for domestic politics in many European countries. And therefore, there was a real danger that there would be a regression, that this sort of more progressive, slightly more assertive position that Europeans were taking on China would be taken back because of the economic hits that one was taken, because of the global economic environment that one was facing, because of the relationship with Russia. And the German strategy, where it would lean on this, is relatively important, because Germany has a lot to lose when it comes to China. So the fact that the German strategy kind of holds the ground, doesn't make huge leaps forward, but it sort of holds the ground where the conversation is at the middle ground of the European conversation, is actually quite important for where the European conversation can move in the next few months. It sort of sets a baseline, and it helps other countries to align itself behind and find some, in German, you have the wonderful word, the Windschatten. I don't know if that exists in English, but, you're sort of protected a little bit by a German strategy like that.
Well, so you've put a lot out there, and there are a number of different points I'd like to pick up on. But one of them is this European context, because in a sense, it almost seems as if Germany is a little bit late to the table in terms of coming out with this sort of forward-looking China strategy. Governments across Europe have been saying much of the same things. Certainly, Washington has been calling out some of the dangers that it sees in dealing with China. And yet, your description just now was that this China strategy sort of holds the middle ground for Europe. Can you talk a little bit about why this has only come about now and not earlier? And I think for that, we obviously have to get at least a little bit into how Olaf Scholz's predecessor, Angela Merkel, saw China, right? She spoke about a relationship of trust with China. There was a somewhat different perspective from the one that this new government has.
Yeah, and it was a somewhat different China that she was dealing with for much of her time. And I think that's really important to point out. I think that's one of the key factors here. I think that the Merkel government over the years has started out with a much more benign setting that it found in China, a much weaker China. A China that was much more conducive to European interests, that was actually quite interested in doing business the way that the Europeans wanted to do it. And there was a lot of benefit for it, for European, particularly German companies. So it is not really surprising that the Merkel administration had a different approach to it. Now, one could argue that in 2014, 15, 16, 17, they could have seen the writing on the wall. they could have seen that things were changing, that there was a kind of a growth in strength and a growth in concentration of power at Xi Jinping's end, that there was a different focus in the economy. All of this stuff was on the table, and it was pretty clear by the statements, particularly after 2017, that Xi Jinping made, that this was the direction of travel. And I think if one wants to fault the Merkel government for a slowness in reaction, I think it's post 2017, there should have been, and there could have been, a rethink of the China approach. But I think we also have to be fair in terms of, the assumption that you take out of a long period of how you have interacted with your counterparts, how you've built a relationship that you actually did find quite trusting, where in 2008, during the global financial crisis, China did support basically the stabilization of the global economy, which was very much in Europe's interest. So there was a good reason for the Merkel administration to kind of have this trusted relationship. And if you look back at all the coalition treaties and how China has been described in them, it's quite neat to kind of put them next to each other. You see the development of how much, like in incremental steps, one has become more skeptical when it comes to the relationship, to the point where we are now. I think it's definitely too late that the realization has set in. If you think about the fact that in 2019 still, Merkel traveled to Wuhan, of all places, like just before the pandemic in a way, and gave a speech on innovation cooperation and technology cooperation and about innovation partnership with China. That was certainly a kind of slightly out of sync with where the debate was already moving on the European end, with the strategic outlook document, with the partner-competitor rival framing that was used at the EU level at the time already. So there was a period that in the late Merkel administration was very much out of sync with where the Europeans were. I think that the Germans have caught up with this. And I think that this government, particularly under the pressure of the FDP and the Green Party, has moved a significant degree, particularly in its language when it comes to China, but also in the shifts that you actually see in policy. But a lot of this is helped, obviously, by the way that China is behaving at the moment, and that the Chinese economy is doing. The fact that you just don't sell as many Volkswagen anymore now because the conditions are not the way they were before, and it's not as supported anymore from the Chinese side. It just certainly changes the environment as well. So I wouldn't just put this down to government action. This has a lot to do with the conditions around as well. And we have seen a number of forward-leaning countries. So you've had a Swedish China strategy or a Dutch China strategy first. You've seen the Baltic countries being a lot more forward-leaning when it comes to their relationship with China. We certainly have seen a huge impact of the Russian invasion of Ukraine on the China conversation in Central and Eastern Europe, where obviously the skepticism is growing when it comes to China's close relationship with Russia. But I think the more important question is, can this generate urgency? This has always been important, but not urgent. And I think we're now at a point where, in the book that's coming out, I compare it to the climate conversation, where the climate conversation has always also been kind of important, but not urgent. And we haven't done the things that we actually needed to do to put ourselves on the right track. And the China conversation is sort of similar in that regard, but it has these same tipping points as well, where it's really hard to go back afterwards, and where you lose certain industries, you lose certain technologies, you lose certain edge, and it makes it harder then to kind of maintain conditions that you want to have. And I think this is where we're now facing that there is an actual price to inaction. Because the German way, I mean, you know that, Steve, very well. The German way would be like, let's just sit this out, wait a little bit, be very prudent, careful, not do too much, be like somewhere in the middle, we can do this. And the problem with this is, just as with climate change, there is no sitting out of this. This is coming, and we need to be prepared for it. And therefore, it requires action without being able to show immediate benefits, but actually by demonstrating immediate costs. And that's something that is at a time when you have to go through the transformation with regard to climate change, that it adds, and you have the Russian invasion of Ukraine, it adds a huge amount of pressure on the German government, because the China dimension is so important for the economy. Sorry for a long answer, but I situate that a little bit.
I think that's great, because I think, one of the things that struck me as I was reading the China strategy was really that the strategy does not hold back any punches, right? It comes out and says China has changed, and it states that as a result of these changes in China and political decisions that are being made in China, we in Berlin need to change our approach, right? This is a major statement, and not one that one would have expected the previous government to make. And you touched on this a little bit, that the government has moved and that it's largely due to factors like the Free Democrats in the government. But I think also the foreign minister, Annalena Baerbock, has certainly from even before she entered this office been more hawkish on China. But how striking do you find this really detailed case for China skepticism coming from the government in Berlin? Were you sort of surprised at the length to which this government went to make this case?
I think everyone who read the coalition treaty carefully could not really be surprised, because that's not, I mean, the coalition treaty sets it out in a very condensed and short version, but it kind of hits all the boxes, it ticks all the boxes, it makes all the kind of difficult and tricky points already there. And I was very convinced that you would not be able to fall behind that, because that would have been something that, then other partners in the coalition would not have accepted as the standard on which went. And this is why this took a long time and why you had to negotiate it. And there are certain things that are obviously more broad and less precise. Yes, you could have had a transparency clause in there that companies would have to kind of detail their interactions with China and would have to be much more forthcoming with that. And you could have had more kind of money attached to certain aspects and said, we put 10 million on the table for this, and we put a 20 million China Knowledge Center here, and we put like 50 million here. And you could have said all these things, and it's not that detailed. Yep. But I think for a strategy document, it sets out the political framework within which the relationship can take place. It is not in every single part logically consistent. There are some of these sentences that are like, China is a systemic competitor and all of this is really difficult, and this is, but that doesn't mean we can't cooperate. On the contrary, on the contrary to what? Hang on, why would that make us better in cooperating? So, there are elements in there that are not in itself logically consistent with what itself it's saying. I was joking a bit with a friend, is that sometimes you have the situation of two sock puppets talking to each other. You have them contradicting a little bit each other in the strategy itself. So you do have that. But I think we also have to be a bit realistic about what these kinds of documents can actually be. And if you ask me, was I surprised? I think I was positively surprised that it was much more precise and pithy and sort of to the point than I had expected. I think by the standards of diplomatic documents that are unbeatable in terms of the wobbliness of the language, this is not on the super wobbly side. This is actually pretty good in terms of the language, and actually much better than the national security strategy, I would say.
Well, and that was one of the questions that I had for you, is how does this fit in with the national security strategy? Because really in that document, there was very, very little about China.
Yes, I mean, that was also a decision to take, right? Because you said you will have the China strategy as well afterwards. And if there hadn't been the idea for the China strategy, I'm sure you would have seen more on China in the national security strategy. So, and it kind of, they link to each other. They sort of organically belong to each other. If you look at the cybersecurity dimension in the China strategy, that very much corresponds with the national security strategy. If you look at the critical infrastructure dimension of the China strategy, that very much ties into the national security strategy. So they are organically linked with each other. And they acknowledge that China is a security challenge, which I think is like, sometimes these things seem so natural, particularly in a US context, but they're not. And the phrase that says, the economic interactions that Germany has with China are not supposed to contribute to human rights violations in China and are not supposed to contribute to China's rise as a military power. If you interpret those widely, that means a whole lot of stuff. So there is a lot of juice in it that is sort of hidden in the language that can be used, if you want the glass half full version, for changing policy. That doesn't have to be used. And this is sort of where the weakness lies, where this will all come down to implementation. Now, you can say out loud 500 times, no bailout anymore. If the companies want to be in China, it's at their own risk and at their own peril. But when push comes to shove, will that be really what's the case when there's tens of thousands of jobs on the line? Yes or no? I don't know. I think this will hopefully not have to be tested. But I think this is where I'm a bit worried that some of the companies will call the government's bluff and will say, you can say that, but we don't believe you.
So related to that, I have a question from one of our viewers, which reads as follows. Is the slow awakening to the direction China was taking attributable in part to the profits that private German companies were making all along the way. Why would the government want to interfere with its leading industries who were all committed to expanding China trade? And did not these profits blind the businesses that their grand hopes for a complete China market penetration were naive?
Yes, is the short answer. But I think it's a bit more complicated, because I think in the US context, what one could see was that the China business created a cost immediately on society. It meant jobs moved to China. It meant companies were doing well in China, but it also meant that there was an immediate cost imposed on the kind of US taxpayer on the other end, and the US consumer. Yes, it could buy cheaper products from China, but also jobs were lost. In Germany, that situation was very different because it was much more complementary in a way. So if you think about a German car producer, then a German car producer continued to produce cars in Germany and Europe for Europe. It produced cars in North America and Latin America for the American market. It produced cars in China for China. It just sold more cars. It wasn't that while cars were produced in China, jobs were lost in Germany. Quite the contrary, some of these jobs were actually grown because there was a great amount of R&D budget there was more innovation capacity there, etc. So it's not just that the companies have benefited, it just wasn't, there was no negative impact on Germany and on the Germans. So overall, it's quite cynically put it in the book a little bit of saying, as long as the German chancellor would travel regularly to China and say that the human rights situation was bad, things were sort of okay, and people didn't put it very high on their hierarchy of priorities. It's like things with China are okay. They're not necessarily our closest partners. They're not necessarily our friends, but we can do good business with each other, and it's sort of a relationship that works. And I think the realization that is at the core of the China strategy now is that old logic doesn't work anymore. Our companies, some companies are still making good money in China, but we know that this is a temporary arrangement. We know that a lot of companies have been pushed out of these businesses and have been pushed out of these markets, that market openings that were formally given are informally closed, that the sales are just not looking the way they're looking anymore in most sector or in some sectors. And it's very different sector by sector. So you can't even say with like a broad brush stroke, and you can say, oh yeah, it's shitty for all European companies, or it's bad for all German companies. No. That's not true. There are German companies in China at the moment making very, very, very good business. And that's obviously making it difficult at a time where the economy is under strain already. And I think that does give leverage to the companies to influence the government to not rock the boat.
So I have a follow-up to that from another one of our viewers who writes, as the German export engine slows, how will the government balance this new China strategy with caution to not alienate the large Chinese market for German products? You just said that there are,
and this is a super important one, because I think this is one of the most misleading ones in the discussion, because there's different kinds of dependencies. Our exports to China are going down. Our imports from China are going up. This is not necessarily just about the export market. Right. This is about German companies in China benefiting from the Chinese market in China, selling in China, creating jobs in China, paying taxes in China. And the big discussion here is, how much does the German state actually benefit from these kinds of business interactions with China? And I think this is where the change is really taking place, because the export model, we can see in the numbers already, that's not working out that much anymore. Those numbers have been going down consistently. And we already, it's a bit like, we need to figure out a solution to this anyway. This will happen. And therefore, what are the steps we're going to take? It's not to say, well, we could leave everything as it is, and then everyone could nicely export to China, but sure, we decide to not do this anymore. It's like, that's not like that. The exports are going down anyway. So we need to have a change in our approach, and we need to explore different markets, and we need to figure out a solution to deal with this changing dynamic. But I think it's really important, because sometimes these things are being put together and mixed, and then you're talking about 40% of Volkswagen cars being sold in China, but it sort of misses the point that these cars are not all produced in Germany and then shipped to China. Right. The interesting bit is when companies are starting to, so as long as you had this kind of produce in Europe for Europe, produce in the US and Latin America for America, produce in China for China and Asia, everything sort of stays stable. When you have production of German cars in China that are then exported to Europe, then you lose the jobs here. That's the problem moment. And that's the moment we're at. And I think that's the kind of really big realization that is taking place, that China has become a huge exporter of cars, and that Chinese exports are doing better, although not as good as they could. And the Chinese economy is in trouble, and we can talk about that as well. But that exerts even greater pressure, because that has a dynamic that it sets into motion that will again negatively impact German interests. It doesn't make China more likely to cooperate. It doesn't make China more likely to be friendly or nice on any of these issues. And it doesn't make China more open for business. That's just empirically not provable right now.
Yeah. So Janka, you've already kind of talked about this, but not with these terms. And a couple of our viewers have asked about some of the terms that have been used. This China strategy was sort of promoted as one of de-risking rather than decoupling, right? And there's a lot of concern, particularly in the transatlantic context, about what that means. And whether de-risking goes far enough from a U.S. perspective. You've shared a little bit of what this will look like in terms of some of the economic relationships, but can you talk a little bit about de-risking versus decoupling and how that might play out, particularly for Germany, but in the broader European context?
I mean, one can be a bit funny about this and can say, we choose to call it de-risking because decoupling was the US term, and we wanted to just do something similar, but that doesn't sound so American. Right. And now the Americans are using de-risking, so we have to find a new term pretty soon to differentiate ourselves. But kind of jokes set aside, I do think that there's a decoupling myth that has been kind of ongoing for a long time, that, it's a nice strawman that you can build. You say, but we cannot decouple from China. It's impossible to do that. It's like, no, it's not a law of physics. It's really kind of, it's undesirable. And it's going to be very costly, but it's certainly not impossible. It's certainly possible within the range of possibilities, but it's certainly not something that anyone would want. And there's actually not a single serious actor that says, we need full decoupling from China in all sectors. This is not a serious conversation, neither in the US nor in Europe. And I think where the de-risking term came in was that was language that both Europe and the US could agree on, and saying we're in a relationship with China where asymmetric dependencies are high, and where that is a problem for us, because if China is using its leverage, then it could create costs for us that we don't want to bear. I do think, though, that we have to be really clear that, and it may sound very trivial, and I'm not trying to be funny here, but China doesn't want to be de-risked. And we have to take that into account, because if you think about the fact that we say we would like to, in the strategy as well, we would like to reduce asymmetric dependencies on China. At the same time, you have the Chinese government being very clear and saying we need to create asymmetric dependencies on China, because that is something that gives us leverage and strength. These goals you can't get those together without friction. You will necessarily run into a situation where you will be in conflict on these issues. And that's something that I think is still more internalized on the US end, where this is clear that the de-risking bit also will create conflict situations, where the Europeans are still using the phrase as but this is the soft version. We don't actually mean this harm. We can do all the nice bits. And there's a lot of areas in which the trade with China is going to be very uncontroversial. Dan Rosen from the Rhodium Group's always said it's underwear and socks kind of version of trade, where there's a lot of trade that is absolutely unaffected by the kind of changing relationship. And we see that in the trade figures right now between the US and China as well. Trade's up. It's not that there is a huge kind of dip in the relationship. It's more the question of high technology exports. Are the Europeans going to export things that the Americans don't want them to export? I'm turning on the lights here. It's getting very dark in Germany. And is there a kind of dimension to this that would undercut the transatlantic relationship? And this is where the juice is actually at, and this is where the de-risking conversation comes in. And I'm a bit I think Europeans are very much at fault for creating this myth as well, because we have a lot of European politicians on the record saying, we don't want this American decoupling. We want this other version of things. We want this European way. And I think it's used as a domestic tool to play to a domestic audience. And it's not necessarily helpful for creating the broader also understanding in the public that some of these steps will have costs, and that this is about, that there is not a cost-free rejigging of the German economy. There is a long-term benefit that one can speak about, but to say all of this will happen and no one will pay a price. We will lead the green transition. We will be able to de-risk our relationship with China, and all of this will happen within the framework of the rules-based international order by adhering to all of the WTO rules, and at the same time without any frictions with anyone whatsoever. Mm-hmm. That's just kind of a dream version of things that doesn't exist. And I think it's time to be a bit more honest about that.
So in terms of that sort of honesty, while the strategy does not call for decoupling, it certainly suggests that Germany needs to diversify its trade and its investment ties to China and to the region as a whole. In your very opening remarks today, you said that the world had changed, right? The environment had changed. One of the big factors in that was Russia's invasion of Ukraine. And one of the questions that I found myself asking many of our German visitors to New York was whether the government was drawing any lessons from its experience of dependence on Russian energy when it came to dealing with China. And so I'd like to maybe back it up a little bit and hear from you what sort of lessons you think the German government might have drawn from its energy dependence as it looked at China and looked at the trade and investment interconnections that exist.
I mean, it oozes that, right? The strategy oozes that fear as well. It very much has that spirit of saying we cannot afford that to happen again. And this is why you see a lot of movement in areas that are sort of structurally similar. So where we see a lot of movement is, for example, on critical raw materials and on kind of how do you generate a alternative supply chain for that? Who do you need to talk to? Can you talk to Serbia about lithium, and where do you get your cobalt from in the future? Can you create refining capacities? Do you need alliances that can be built to generate the kind of mining and refining capacity elsewhere outside of China? You see a lot of political kind of movement here, and there's Critical Raw Materials Act here, and you have to, seems to be a place where action is happening at the moment because it is sort of structurally similar, right? It's about getting a resource from somewhere. It's an import dependence. It doesn't actually tackle, we were and we are not export dependent on Russia. That's just not the case. It was a market, but not like the comparison to China is a very different one. So by sort of saying, we have to target the low-hanging fruit first. And I think the import dependence is in the end structurally easier to deal with than the export dependency and the market dependency. Mm-hmm. It is a question of where do you get your antibiotic supply from? If you think that it is not secure, that more than 90% of your antibiotic-free products are being produced in China, then you can do something about that. In the end, that takes money and political will. It doesn't take rocket science. You can produce these products in Europe. You can produce them elsewhere where you think they are safe channels. The question is, are these really the biggest risks? And this is where the whole de-risking conversation is really interesting. It is, if you want to talk about de-risking, you have to sort of define risk first, right? Because otherwise you can't really say what you want to de-risk. But that also means you have to have a hierarchy of risks. You have to have a prioritization of risks because you will not be able to de-risk all risks. There will continue to be risks. So what are the risks that you can actually live with? And what we saw throughout the pandemic was that our massive dependence on PPEs from China was actually in the end a more trivial problem to solve. It was relatively quickly that we could solve those problems, whereas other supply chain problems that we had with regard to China were much more problematic. Mm-hmm. And so I think it is about getting to this point now where we can draw a better map of risks and be realistic, because not everything that has to do with China and where there is a large dependence on China is actually a huge societal risk. But the antibiotics are an interesting example in that regard, because if you talk about a low-hanging fruit that has huge, like if you categorize them a bit in a scientific way, mm-hmm. I would say what are the ones that are actually low-hanging fruit because you can actually tackle them, because it's not like cobalt that you don't have and you need to get from somewhere else. So something you can actually produce yourself, but that has a societal impact if it's not there. If suddenly access to solar panels is cut, and there's not going to be massive societal turmoil in Germany, it would be massively problematic for the green transition. It would be massively problematic for other projects, but it would be a problem that would be kind of having to dealt with, but you would have some time. If there are no antibiotics, then you have a problem within days. You have a societal problem that you create pretty quickly. So I would say that's relatively high risk from political instability levels, and it's relatively low cost in terms of fixing it. So I would say those are the sweet spots where you need action first, and then you can start slowly going through these hierarchies. That means you have to at the same time do the Critical Raw Materials Act, and you won't have the luxury of not doing this simultaneously. But I think this honesty is about talking about where are the real risks, where are the risks that are politically relevant, where are the risks that are sort of risks to individual companies, where that risk then needs to be borne by those individual companies, and where are the risks that are risks to society at large. And I think the strategy tries to kind of get to that on critical infrastructure, on the question of 5G networks, and these questions where you say there are risks to society at large.
So one of our viewers asks, who do you think the beneficiaries of this de-risking could be? Is it countries like Japan or India when it comes to supply chains?
Yes. So, I mean, it's going to be all of them, because I think this idea that I think this is sort of the imaginary fantastic solution would be, sure, we did this with China and it didn't quite work out, but now we've learned a lesson and we'll do the same thing with India and it will be great. Right. That would be the kind of worst lesson drawn from this. I don't think that there is any replication of this model that we will find anywhere else in the world. I also think that for good reasons, many countries around the world have woken up to their own interests and are going to say, well, yeah, I mean, we would like to do business with you, but sort of under our conditions as well, and you can't dictate those. And then Indonesia has its own interest and India has its own interest, and we will see a lot of compromises there. The question, I think, for Europe at large is, can it create a large enough coalition of countries that has an attractive pull factor for doing business at least kind of close to the ideal version of what we would like to see? What are the countries that continue to have a huge interest in maintaining kind of the contours of an international trading order that is beneficial to our interest? Because this is what it's about in the end, right? We have created an international trading order that is very beneficial to our interests when it goes according to rules, etc. And now this trading order, by the way Chinese companies are acting in it and the Chinese state is acting in it, are working in the interest of the Chinese state. And we don't like that. And so this is something where, can we create conditions under which we can make a good case for an attractive model that is attractive for others to be part of? And I think this will come down to a lot of political will and actually ability to generate these coalitions. And I do think we see some effect of that. We see, I think, in the transatlantic relationship, a lot of movement on areas where we may not have seen it otherwise, where there's this sort of, we sort of need to work together now, and there's not a lot of things we can do about it. We actually just have each other on this. And if we want to create those conditions, it's the two of us or no one. With Japan, we have a similar situation. With India, partially, but India has never been closer to basically the West on these questions than it has been now. And so I think there is a huge pull factor that the rules and regulations that Europe and Germany wants to govern international trade by, that it has, and it shows in our bilateral trading agreements, etc. But so this is one of the things that I'm very, that I think one needs to put the finger where it hurts a little bit. It's very easy to say we want to protect the rules-based international order. But what is it that we actually want to protect? Is it not about rebuild? Is it not about recreate? And is that not actually more work than just protect? So I think we can't be the guardians of an order lost. And we can't be the ones that are kind of always just raising the WTO and the WTO and the WTO. It's very important, but do we have to move forward and move that? And that's particularly difficult, I think, in the German context, to the holy grail of multilateralism. How can we go into unilateral formats, into less universal formats within which we can pursue our interests? That's going to be a really difficult negotiation process for us, just structurally and intellectually. It is harder for us.
Well, and I think that's a very important point that you make, right? The China strategy is based in a multilateral approach. There are sections of it that also focus on working with the global South. And that's something that you touched on earlier in your remarks. There are a couple of viewers who have asked that you talk a little bit more about A, sort of China's influence in the global South, and B, what we in Europe and the United States can do to provide sort of a counterexample to that. You talked a little bit before about PPE coming from China. Certainly, one of the topics that's come up in several of our discussions in recent months has been vaccine diplomacy or lack of vaccines to countries in the global South, and that's been something that's turned some of those countries away from the West. We have a lot of work that we need to do collectively to bring about supporters in the global South. To what degree is that part and parcel of the China strategy and even Germany's national security strategy?
I think it is part of it. I think we have to be very, very careful with the counteroffer framing. I think it is very unhelpful to frame this as if this was a battle for the global South.
Yeah.
It's a battle. It's a battle in the global South with the global South. There's agency. All of those countries have interest and agency, and it's not just we make them a better offer and then they surely take ours. That's not how this works. And I think that's been the main realization, I think, is that just saying, but we will offer you something nicer, will still lead countries to make their own judgment calls on where they think their interests are best served. And I think it's really not ideal to frame this as, oh, if only we would put more money on the table, which in many instances, by the way, we actually already do, than China, then we would be fine. But to also see how much this is part of a political conversation within countries where it is about bargaining also to get the best deal and to get the best offer and the most attractive offer. And I think this is where we have to be a bit more creative in how we interact with the global South. One of the thoughts that I think goes through my head a lot at the moment is, when we had the fossil fuel-based economy, then we sort of when it started, thought it would go on forever, and we sort of built those structures on that. And we now see that the transition cost in Europe, and if you look at Germany, in Eastern Germany or in the Ruhrgebiet, is really high transition costs for moving away from an economy that we sort of built for eternity. We thought it could last. Now, when we move to a minerals-based economy, we actually know that we want that to end, right? We want to move to full circularity. We actually don't want to extract cobalt from the DRC for the next 500,000 years, but actually it's a limited amount of time that we want that. And then we want to move to circularity and want to take less out of the ground. So what is the offer that we can make to countries that is basically thinking the next transition already? Think about what are the jobs not in the next 10 years that people can do in mines or in refining or etc. What are the jobs in 50 years when that is over? What is the transition offer that we're making? What is the idea of how that economy could look like? I think this is all stuff that we're just thinking about at the moment, and that I think keeps my head busy at the moment. What could that look like? What is it that we, how can we, for example, think about an attractive contract that says mining is possible, and then we will move recycling facilities in 5 years' times there as well. Is that economically profitable or not? Does that work for the countries? Does this work for us? But I think these are along the lines we have to think that we have a huge opportunity here with these two large transitions of the way our economy has been structured, but also the way kind of the global relationships are restructured, that we can use that as a new way of doing business. But it certainly will require a lot of mental flexibility. And I think, it's not just Olaf Scholz likes to speak about not being etepetete. And it does sound a bit like he means, we should strike the odd dirty deal as well. I don't think it's all about the dirty deal that needs to be struck. I think it's about figuring out whether we can move away from ways we have done things before and sell that politically at home. How can you make the political case for change is, I think, the more challenging task. I think people are quite honestly quite happy to swallow a dirty deal. That has not been necessarily a German problem in the past. So I think it's more this kind of, how do you communicate about this in a way that you say, we have a vision for how this can look like in the future.
So this is a somewhat different question, but several people in the Q&A have raised questions about intellectual property and state-sponsored theft of intellectual property when dealing with China. I guess the way of summarizing the question could be to what extent is the German media reporting on this, and how aware is the general public about the pervasiveness of Chinese IP theft, and what's the government doing to respond to that?
Yeah, it's a tricky one. It's a tricky one because it comes down to government to companies actually even reporting on this. And that's I think the trickiest bit. I think the government is quite capable of responding to it if it actually knows about what's going on and has a credible case to make. That seems to me the most common problem, that companies have a larger interest in maintaining their shares in some companies. And we're talking really about a limited number of companies have a greater interest in maintaining their business relationship in China intact and kind of swallowing the IP theft, which has happened over the last decades. And this only comes down to whether companies will feel that that balance is shifting. Does the cost of the IP theft outweigh the kind of benefits that are still being sought, or the imaginary benefits of an imaginary future Chinese market that they could be imaginary part of in the future? I think that's a lot of this is driven also by a wish, an idea, an illusion of the Chinese market, and an illusion of, this will go back to normal. The party will somehow, the Chinese Communist Party will move back to that Hu Jintao era because there is no other way, because this model is outliving itself, because we can see that it's demonstrating right now it's not working, and the party will come to its senses. And I think that's, we have very little empirical evidence for that at the moment. For that is the trajectory. The opposite is the case. And so I think, the IP theft question is more of a symptom of something than an actual cause. It is sort of an embodiment of where the relationship is and where the balance lies at the moment. In the end, the question of outbound investment screening and the question of what can be transferred in the future. Does the state need to play a role in this, or does it not need to play a role in this? Is there an interest of the companies themselves to protect their IP, or does the state, out of the interest of the general public, have to protect innovation that is taking place in Europe because this is in the state interest? That's pretty invasive as a mechanism. It's pretty invasive for a German economy that has not been used to these mechanisms. So I think there is this is the kind of tug of war that we're seeing, but I think it's a tug of war, if we're very honest, that is taking place in the US as well, where there's a big discussion about how many chips do you still want to sell in China to remain globally competitive, to then be able to have research and development budgets that make you competitive in the future with a Chinese, with Chinese chip producers? Is this kind of, what is the chicken, what is the egg here? Do you need to stop need to stop accelerating Chinese development to maintain your edge or not? So these discussions, I think, are not alien to the US conversation. They're very live there as well. And there's a lot of fighting going on there. And the same fighting is going on in the European debate as well.
I mean, do you, one of our viewers is curious, do you think that as a result of this situation with China and the war in Ukraine and some of the activities that Russia has been engaged in, that the German government will increase its cybersecurity and cyber awareness? Is that something that's already happening?
Well, it's in the strategy as well. I mean, there's a big section on it, which I think is also a very good one to read through and to think through. And we're pretty bad on it so far. So in terms of what are the big construction zones for the Europeans on this? So it's cybersecurity, certainly. It's the question of kind of digital infrastructure and protecting critical infrastructure, and it's intelligence. Do we actually know what we need to know about how the world is at the moment? And do we have a sort of sovereignty of our intelligence gathering at the moment? Or are we reliant on actually US information, or British information for that matter, on some of these matters because we actually don't know ourselves? And I think it's enhancing the capacity of what we can know to limit the impact of those things that we can't know. And I think this is where, baby steps are being taken. But this is where a huge push could really help. And this is something where enhancing your intelligence capabilities is inherently something that is, I would say, uncontroversial to sell politically. I don't think this is a huge problem to say we actually want to spend more money on being less dependent on US intelligence. I think you can sell that in France, but you could also sell that probably in the Baltics quite well. This is not something that is hugely controversial in the European context. It just takes a bit of a leadership role here as well. And this is where I would say my biggest criticism of the strategy would lie. It's at no point does it imply a German leadership role at the European level. It's sort of, the wording around it is, we will support processes and we will help with and we will consult. But it doesn't yet say at any point, we will take the lead on. We will grab this topic and we will run with it. And we will say this is absolutely crucial and necessary for the future of the European Union to take this on and to take this on head on. And it doesn't only have to be intelligence, it also is the question of critical infrastructure protection, etc. Do we want to have these capabilities? I don't think, and that's my kind of, that's the criticism I would say that could be there. It's not good enough for Germany to be supportive of things. I think on these matters, a little bit of leadership will be required, and kind of getting ourselves to do that would be an important step for the EU to actually have what it needs in the new world that is emerging.
Well, that was one of the things that you said earlier on, was that the strategy does a great job of sort of describing Berlin's ambition and provides a great Bestandsaufnahme, or sort of assessment of the current realities. One of the questions that I had for you was how does this then look in terms of implementation, right? And if you're saying that nowhere does it say anything about a German leadership role, that's certainly a shortcoming. One of our viewers is curious as to what you see as actual actionable items or deliverables in the months ahead to try to really fill this strategy with life, right? To make it a reality, to make it something that is implemented. Have you thought about that at all?
Yeah, so I think one of the things is the critical infrastructure law. That is an umbrella law that is being announced in the strategy. Do we see that in action? The next thing is to be seen is the question of 5G. Does Germany move on this or does it not move on this? The legal as the strategy points out, the legal framework exists already for exclusions. It has been pointed out by the EU Commission quite vividly that Germany needs to act on this. Will it actually do something about this? So these are the kind of the very concrete points in which one could see some action. And then I think we can look into the more into the smaller things, right? It's about enhancing China capacity within the government as well. Where does the hiring go? What are, look at the next job ads that are coming from ministries. How many people with China profiles are being looked for? Because not all of this, as I said in the beginning, and it would have been kind of good to have some massive money behind this as well. And say, this is like the site and vendor on China politics as well. Sure. But you can also do a lot of things without this actually being new money. You just kind of, where do you shift the focus? So whether this urgency that the strategy indeed kind of has in it, whether this translate into urgent changes in action across the entirety of the things that are being put out in terms of strengthening Europe, strengthening Germany, strengthening Europe and Germany for a world that has changed. I think that's the big kind of question mark here. And we see a lot of movement, as I said, on critical raw materials, etc. We see a lot of the movement in the right direction. Will this be done half-heartedly, or will this be done with full conviction? I do think that we have to give this government a little bit of credit for the fact that the moving away from Russian oil and gas has not been a half-hearted move. This has been pretty decisively undertaken. So under pressure, the German government seems to be quite capable of doing that. I think we need a similar level of urgency and a similar level of decisiveness for attacking some of these points, because the one thing that is the similarity between the China conversation and the climate conversation is that time's running out. Even if the Chinese economy is growing at a slower pace, even if the Chinese economy is in more trouble, the relative strength of Europe vis-a-vis China is not growing at the moment. And it's not, the trajectory at the moment is not a positive one for Europe. So the earlier we take steps from a position of relative strength, the better. And I think that's something that we find as like an analysis point. Does that get internalized? Does this get into is this the spirit with which the government is in the future acting or not? Or do we see hesitance there holding back? I think one of the other areas that we see is going to be that big discussion about de-risking and the question of how much can it be industry-led? When we talk about hierarchy of risks and priorities of risk, can those really be set by companies, or should not, if we're talking about de-risking for society, does this not need to be set by the government? Because actually, you can't say that the risks that the companies see and the government sees are exactly interchangeable and the same thing. So these questions, and I think we will see a big discussion in September when this strategy document then is also being taken apart in the German Bundestag, because that was the one thing, because it came so late. The parliament was already in recess, so we'll have a full version of this, of the debate again in the fall. And for China analysts like me, this is obviously fantastic because we can discuss the whole thing twice and 3 times and 4 times. And so now we had a pre-version of this before the summer. We had some time to think about it over the summer. We'll have another big go at it then in the fall.
So do you feel that there's really that sense of urgency, or will we have to wait and see how some of these talks in the Bundestag come out?
I do think there is a sense of urgency. It's just the question of whether the sense of urgency translates into the right sense of speed. Right. Yeah. So I think it would be actually wrong to say that this government doesn't understand that China is a challenge. I mean, the strategy is a really good embodiment of the fact that this government sees this as a challenge. But is it in the hierarchy of priorities high enough to actually do the things that are necessary? And can one create the political conversation around this that make these things possible because you can communicate them as policies domestically? I think that will be the big question. And I don't think we know that yet. It's a bit too early.
So obviously we'll have to watch that. Another topic that we haven't even really touched on in our conversation today is Taiwan. And of course, it's very difficult to talk about the China strategy without talking about Taiwan at least a little bit. In the strategy, the government emphasized that it wanted to de-escalate around Taiwan because security in the Taiwan Strait is important for peace and stability throughout the region, right? I mean, I think that was some of the language that was even used. What's your sense of how closely the government in Berlin is watching the tensions between China and Taiwan?
Oh, very closely. That's not the point. It's just not so sure what to do about it.
Yes.
And I think that holds true for most countries that are observing what's going on at the moment. I think the level of friction and the level of tension is incredibly high at the moment. We see the number of incursions going up. We see the level of pressure that is just in this relationship growing. And I think the de-escalation point is a very self-explanatory one. I think anyone who is currently has their 5 senses together wishes for a de-escalation of this situation, because the overall implications of any further escalation for the global economy, for global security, for our wealth, prosperity, and security and stability here, but also around the world, would be devastating. And therefore, I think it's very sensible to call for de-escalation. The question is just, what is it that you can do to contribute to that? What are the things that Europe can put to the table that make it harder for the Chinese government to take certain steps? What are the things that can be done to encourage and support Taiwan without actually encouraging any forms of independence calls? And I think the strategy is very clear on that as well, of saying, we're not actually in for anything here. It's not about supporting anything that Taiwan does. It is about kind of mutually agreed upon solutions and non-changes to the status quo. And this includes China's continued changes to the status quo that we're seeing at the moment, where it changes the military balance significantly, but it also includes no changes to the status quo on the side in Taiwan. So I think there is a great sense and understanding how important it is to do this, but the level of ambition when it comes to really solving this, supporting, and this is more limited, as a more limited understanding of what can be done to contribute to this. I think what is more important for the Europeans is what needs to be communicated to the public. What is you cannot communicate, or you cannot say any longer that this doesn't matter to Europeans. This would be absolutely the wrong way of preparing for a potential crisis situation. I think it is important to communicate that this really matters to Europeans, and it really matters directly to their own interests. And therefore, there is a sincere interest to have clear language around this and maintain very strong positions on maintaining stability in the Taiwan Strait. And I think that's something where this is more a communication job internally. We had polling at ECFR done. This is 62% of Europeans. It was 11 countries that were polled, and out of those 11 countries, 62% of the respondents would not support the US in the case of a Taiwan contingency. I think that's something that has a lot to do with a lack of understanding of what it was all framed around this is US versus China, and not framed around the Taiwan question as such. And I think there's a lot of work to be done in explaining what really the problem is, the history of it, the complexity of it, And this is a big task for us all that are working on this topic to do, to just generate a sense of understanding, you know, what's the difference between the one China policy and the one China principle? What do you need to understand about the history of the conflict? We're just very bad at that in Europe in general, in terms of Asian history. And I think we need to get better.
Well, Janka, I want to thank you for helping us understand the situation much better. Thank you for taking the time, and we've had really a very wide-ranging conversation covering security issues, economic issues, domestic issues. What we didn't really get to is the Chinese response to the China strategy, which I would have loved to have talked to you about as well. But as you indicated, there is more than enough to talk about in the months ahead, and I hope we'll have an opportunity to continue the conversation. I wish you the best of luck with the release of your book. We can certainly think about having a Zoom event to talk about your book if that would be of interest to you. But this has been terrific. So thank you very much. Herzlichen Dank.
Thank you for the invitation. It was a great pleasure.